A dog without sight, a man with no escape. One was bound in the freezing dark, the other leading a pack through the storm. An orange blindfold where eyes should be. No leash, no handler, no command. Only the unshakable pull of instinct. And when the world turned its back on Deputy Ryan Cooper, 5 forgotten strays did not. Their leader, scarred and sightless, smelled the fear, heard the chains hidden in the silence, and followed a path no one else could see. What happened next will make you believe in loyalty, in miracles, and in second chances. If you believe that God still sends his angels, sometimes on 4 paws, then stay here, because what you are about to witness might live in your heart forever. The winter in Pine Hollow, Colorado, had a way of swallowing sound. By late January, the town sat buried under a quilt of white so thick that even the wind seemed reluctant to stir. The pine forests that framed the valley were heavy with snow, their branches bowed in frozen reverence, and the old mining roads leading in from the mountains were little more than memory beneath ice. The morning light, pale and watery, crept slowly over the rooftops, casting long shadows that trembled with the occasional gust. The temperature hovered just below 0, and the air carried that brittle sharpness that made every breath feel like inhaling glass. Along the snow-packed trail on the northern edge of town, 5 figures padded silently in single file. At their head walked Max. Once, Max had been the pride of the Colorado Mountain Search and Rescue Unit, a German shepherd with the build of a soldier and the soul of a guardian. He was 7 years old now, with a thick coat of sable and black fur dusted with frost, and a small silver streak marking his muzzle like a badge earned from years of service. But the most striking thing about him was the bright orange blindfold tied snugly over his eyes, a worn strip of fabric given to him after the rockfall that stole his sight during a rescue mission 3 years ago. That mission had saved 2 trapped hikers, but left Max buried for hours under timber and stone. And though he lived, the light never returned to his eyes. Yet blindness had not diminished him. Max's other senses had sharpened into weapons, ears that could detect the faintest shift of snow underfoot, a nose that could thread a story from the subtlest scent. His step was sure, his posture unbowed, and the 4 dogs trailing behind him followed as if the path he walked was carved in stone. The rest of his pack were strays, each carrying their own history of abandonment and survival. Duke, the second in line, was a broad-shouldered German shepherd with a torn ear and a gruff, cautious nature. He was fiercely protective, particularly of Max. Sable, a smaller, wiry female with storm gray fur, had a limp in her left hind leg from an old snare injury. Behind her came Ranger 2, named by a shelter worker who'd once mistaken him for Max, tall, lean, and with a restless energy that made him quick to scout ahead. Last was Molly, the youngest, a year-old shepherd mix with oversized paws and a tendency to press close to the others when the wind howled. They moved like a unit, forged by necessity, bound not by chains or commands, but by a silent code: survive together. That morning, the air was so still they could hear the faint creak of the frozen river to the east. Max led them along the outer edge of Pine Hollow, past the skeletal remains of old railway fencing, and toward the ghostly silhouette of a warehouse, a hulking 3-story structure of faded red brick, its windows shattered or covered in warped boards, its chain-link fence sagging under the weight of years and snow. It had once been a logging supply depot during the town's boom years, but now it stood as a monument to neglect. Max's paws slowed, his head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring. The pack halted behind him, instinctively alert. At first it was just a thread of sound, so faint it could have been the memory of wind. Then it came again, a low, uneven moan, muffled by walls and snow, not the bark of a fox or the cry of a bird. This was human, weak, desperate. Inside that basement, Deputy Ryan Cooper sat bound to a wooden chair. At 32, Ryan was lean but solid, with short-cropped dark hair and a jaw that normally carried an easy half-smile. His eyes, sharp and watchful, were now covered by a strip of black cloth pulled tight enough to press against his skin. His wrists, tied behind him with coarse rope, were raw from struggling. His uniform shirt, muddy, torn, still clung to him like the last thread of his identity, though his badge was gone. Ryan had been a deputy in Pine Hollow for 5 years. known in town for greeting children by name and for stopping to check on the elderly who lived along his patrol route. But 3 nights ago, he'd vanished during a late call near the outskirts. The search had turned up nothing but tire tracks in the snow and the faint smell of gasoline near an abandoned turnoff. In the basement, the concrete walls leached cold into his bones, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb overhead. His head drooped forward as fatigue tugged at him, but the sudden sound of claws on snow outside the building made him lift it again. Max had edged closer to the warehouse, the other dogs spreading out slightly to watch the surroundings. The scent struck him hard, human sweat laced with iron from blood, the musk of fear, and the stale tang of damp concrete. He moved along the building's side until he found a narrow, cracked basement window, its glass frosted and breath-fogged when he pressed his nose to it. Inside, Ryan froze. "Who's there?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a rasp. Max let out a short, low growl, not of menace, but of intent. Ryan's heart jolted. "Is that a dog?" Max pawed at the glass, his nails scratching faintly against it. The orange blindfold hid his eyes, but every line of his body leaned forward, listening, measuring. He pawed again, harder, testing the frame. The window held fast. The scent of blood and mildew curled into his nose. He could not get in. Not yet. Behind him, Duke circled once, letting out a low chuff. Molly pressed closer to Sable. Ranger 2 trotted along the fence line, nose low, marking possible paths. Max turned from the window and took 2 steps back, his ears flicking toward the sound of a distant door creaking open somewhere above the basement. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, descended into the building. Inside, Ryan's body tensed. The bulb overhead swayed slightly with the draft. His captor was coming. Back. Max stood still for a moment, the cold air steaming from his muzzle. Then he pivoted sharply, signaling with a short whine. The pack moved as one, melting back into the snow beyond the warehouse's shadow. They vanished into the white just as a heavy lock slid into place inside, sealing Ryan once more in darkness. For now. The wind had picked up since the pack left the shadow of the old warehouse, hurling loose powder into curling spirals that blurred the horizon. Max moved at a steady pace, nose low to the ground, each step deliberate despite the darkness behind his orange blindfold. His breath steamed into the brittle air, drifting away like signals no one could read. Behind him, the 4 other dogs followed in a loose diamond formation, Duke close to his flank, Sable and Molly weaving slightly to the sides, Ranger 2 scouting a few paces ahead, but always circling back. The scent of blood was still on Max's muzzle, a reminder of the man bound in the basement. The cold gnawed at them, but Max's instincts tugged him toward town. Pine Hollow's main street was quiet, muffled beneath the snow. The painted facades of old storefronts, an antique shop, a cafe that hadn't opened since Christmas, were half buried in drifts. At the far end stood a squat brick building with a faded hand-painted sign over the door, Carter's Radio and Repair. The glass in the door was clouded from the heat inside, and the faint hum of an old tube amplifier leaked into the street. Inside, Emily Carter was bent over a disassembled shortwave radio, her hands deft despite the cold that crept in from the edges of the window frames. She was 30, with light brown hair tied into a messy knot, strands falling into her sharp-featured face. Her eyes were a green-gray that seemed to miss nothing, but they carried the guarded heaviness of someone who had been disappointed too many times. She wore a worn flannel shirt over a thermal layer, and her jeans were faded from years of crawling under workbenches and fixing machinery that no one else in town would touch. Emily had grown up here, the daughter of Ben Carter, a ham radio enthusiast and amateur repairman known for keeping half the valley's communication gear alive during the worst blizzards. Ben had passed 2 winters ago from a sudden heart attack, leaving Emily the shop and his cluttered workshop in the back. Since then, she'd kept his habit of feeding strays behind the building, even when she barely had enough for herself. The bell above the door didn't ring, Emily's first clue. Something was unusual was the faint scrape of claws on the floorboards. She turned to find the doorway filled with the shape of a large German shepherd, snow crusting his fur, an orange blindfold wrapped securely over his eyes. His head dipped, and something heavy dropped onto the wooden floor between them. It was a man's boot, black leather, caked with mud and streaked with dried blood. 2 other dogs followed him in, one broad-shouldered with a torn ear, the other smaller, limping slightly. Both stood stiff, hackles raised, their bodies angled toward the street as if guarding the shop. The air inside seemed to tighten. Emily crouched, her fingers brushing the boot. She recognized the emblem stamped near the heel, a silver star with a pine. Tree in the center, the mark of the Pine Hollow Sheriff's Department. Her stomach knotted. She looked up at the blindfolded dog, whose head was turned slightly toward her, ears alert to every sound she made. "Where did you get this?" she murmured, though she didn't expect an answer. Emily reached for her cell phone, her hand steady even as her pulse jumped. She dialed the sheriff's office and, when a dispatcher picked up, asked for Sheriff Tom Briggs. Briggs arrived 15 minutes later, a swirl of snow trailing in behind him as he pushed through the shop door. He was in his late 50s, with a frame built from years of ranch work before law enforcement, and a face weathered into deep lines by mountain winters. His short silver hair was hidden under a dark beanie, and his heavy coat was dusted white from the storm outside. Briggs had a voice that rarely rose but carried weight when it did. Emily handed him the boot without a word. Briggs turned it over in his hands, his jaw tightening. "This is Ryan's," he said quietly. He glanced at Max, noting the orange blindfold, the calm but intense stance. "Where'd he come from?" "Out of the snow, dropped that at my feet and—" Emily hesitated. "He's not alone." She gestured toward the other dogs, who stood near the door, watching like sentries. Before Briggs could reply, a faint burst of static crackled from the workbench. Emily frowned and moved quickly to the old radio set, one of her father's oldest rigs. She had been repairing it for weeks, but it had sat silent until now. She adjusted the tuning dial, and through the static came a distant clank of metal on metal, followed by a slow, dragging footstep. The sound was faint, but distinct enough to make Briggs stiffen. Emily's mind raced. She had grown up around radios, learning to recognize the subtle echoes of rooms, the metallic edge of certain building materials in transmitted sound. The noise had the hollow timbre of concrete walls, basement walls. Briggs leaned over her shoulder, listening. "That could be anywhere." "Not anywhere," Emily said. "There's interference. See this pattern? That's from the old industrial district near the lumber yard. My dad used to complain about it when he tried to transmit there." Max had moved closer to the bench, his nose lifting slightly as if scent could travel through the static. Briggs looked from the dog to Emily. "If that's Ryan, we need to move fast, but we keep this quiet until we know exactly where." Emily nodded, though her eyes lingered on the radio. She couldn't shake the feeling that her father's old equipment had just handed her a lifeline from the dark. The pack began to shift restlessly, their paws clicking softly on the wood floor. Max turned toward the door, muscles taut, ears angling toward the storm outside. Whatever trail they had taken to get here, it wasn't going to last long in the blowing snow. Briggs slipped the boot into a plastic evidence bag and pulled his coat tighter. "We'll set up a team tonight. Dawn's our best chance before the weather shuts us down. In the meantime," he glanced at Max, then back at Emily. "Keep him close. He might be our only lead." Emily looked at the dog, the fabric of his orange blindfold slightly damp from melted snow. She reached out, hesitating until Max tilted his head toward her touch. Her fingers brushed the warm fur at his neck. "I'll keep him safe," she said. Outside, the storm deepened, swallowing the world beyond Main Street. But inside the small shop, the static from the radio continued to hiss, carrying with it the metallic rhythm of chains and footsteps, proof that somewhere out there, Ryan Cooper was still alive. The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. By dawn, Pine Hollow streets were buried beneath a fresh layer of snow, and the sky hung low with a bruised metallic glow that promised more to come. Sheriff Tom Briggs stood at the edge of the operations table in the small back room of the Carter's radio and repair shop, where Emily had cleared space for maps, a thermos of coffee, and the battered radio that had sparked the night's revelations. Briggs's voice was calm, but clipped as he addressed the small group. "We move now, or we risk losing him to the weather." His gray eyes swept over the faces in the room. Emily stood to one side, pulling on a heavy insulated parka over her flannel and thermals. Beside her was Deputy Claire Mason, the youngest in the department at 27, tall with a runner's build, auburn hair pulled back under a wool cap. Claire was steady under pressure, but her eyes gave away a restless determination. Her older brother had disappeared in the mountains a decade ago, never found, and it had shaped her into someone who refused to leave anyone behind. Briggs traced a gloved finger over the map. The signal Emily picked up points to here, the old Miller lumber yard. Been abandoned for 15 years, half the building's rotting. The basement's the only part likely still standing. Max lay on the floor near the door, his head resting on his front paws, the bright orange blindfold a splash of color against the dim room. The rest of the pack was arranged loosely around him. Duke near the window, eyes tracking every movement. Sable curled up but alert. Ranger 2 pacing slowly. Molly pressed against Max's flank for warmth. Emily glanced at them and then back to Briggs. "They know where to go," she said quietly. "You just have to follow them." Briggs gave a small nod. "That's the plan. No sirens, no lights. Claire, you're on rear watch. Emily," he hesitated. "I don't usually bring civilians, but you've been the one feeding these dogs for months. They'll work better with you there." They set out within minutes. The air outside was sharp enough to sting skin, and the wind drove snow into their faces as they crossed the empty lots toward the edge of town. Emily kept close to Max, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder to let him know she was there. He moved forward with the unhurried certainty of a creature who didn't need sight to read the world. His nose lifted into the wind, catching scents hidden from human senses: blood, old wood, the faint tang of diesel. The lumberyard emerged from the white like the bones of some long-dead giant. The main building loomed ahead, its roof sagging under the weight of snow, windows gaping black. Max stopped just short of the perimeter fence, head tilting slightly. The pack spread out without a sound. Duke and Sable slipped away to the right, circling behind the building. Ranger 2 trotted toward a side alley. Molly stayed near. Emily, her ears twitching at every sound. Emily followed as Max led her along the left side of the building, where a narrow gap yawned between a collapsed wall and the frozen earth. The space was barely wide enough for him to slide through, but Max lowered himself and pushed forward. Emily crouched to watch, seeing his muscles ripple under his thick fur as he squeezed into the darkness beyond. Inside, the basement was colder than the air outside. The concrete floor was slick with ice, and the flickering light from a lone bulb cast long, restless shadows across the walls. In the center of the room sat Ryan Cooper, his head slumped forward, a black cloth tied tightly over his eyes. His hands were bound behind him, the rope biting into skin rubbed raw. Ryan stirred at the sound of paws on the cement. His voice was rough, cracked from hours without water. "Who's there?" Max patted closer, the click of his nails sharp in the quiet. He paused at Ryan's side, sniffing, then gently nudged the man's knee. Ryan froze, breathing shallow. "A dog?" he whispered. The scent of fear and exhaustion told Max enough. He stepped around to Ryan's side and lowered his head, finding the knot on the blindfold. His teeth closed softly but firmly on the edge of the cloth. The knot was poorly tied, stiff with sweat and dust, but Max worked at it with patient determination, tugging and loosening until the fabric shifted. A final pull, and the cloth slipped free, letting dim light touch Ryan's eyes. Ryan winced at the sudden brightness, blinking rapidly until he could make out the shape of the dog beside him. The orange blindfold caught his gaze. You can't see," he murmured, the realization sinking in. Max gave a low whine, stepping back slightly. Behind them, the distant scrape of claws on concrete announced Molly's arrival, her small frame slipping in through the gap. She gave a quick glance at Ryan, then toward the far door, ears pricked in warning. Ryan's voice was steadier now. "You're not alone, are you?" From outside, faint but distinct, came the muffled sound of Duke's bark, a single sharp note, answered by Ranger 2's deeper voice. The pack was in position. Emily, crouched at the basement gap, caught sight of Max moving toward the far corner, the same direction the sound had come from. She felt the weight of the storm pressing in, knew they had minutes before the wind would bury their tracks. She turned to Claire, who had taken up position just behind her. "They're ready." Claire's jaw tightened. "Then we move." The sound of footsteps came first, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any of the search team. Down in the dim, icy basement, Ryan Cooper stiffened, his freshly freed eyes flicking toward the shadow stretching under the door. Max stood at his side, motionless except for the twitch of his ears. The faint scent of cigarette smoke and damp wool drifted in, announcing the approach of the man who had held Ryan captive. The door creaked open, spilling a wedge of cold air into the basement. The man who stepped in was broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy canvas coat stained with oil and mud. His beard was patchy, streaked with gray, and his eyes had the restless flick of someone always expecting a fight. His name was Earl Maddox, 48, a former mill worker who had lost his job when the lumberyard closed. Years of drinking and drifting had carved deep lines into his face. Resentment had become his fuel. The town was his enemy. Earl's gaze landed on Ryan, then on the orange blindfolded dog standing guard beside him. He sneered. "So, they sent a mutt to keep you company?" He stepped closer, a worn revolver hanging loose in his right hand. Max took a single step forward, chest low, tail still. Then, with a sharp burst of sound, he let out one short, clipped bark. It was the signal. From outside the building, Duke's deep voice answered instantly, followed by Ranger 2's rolling bark. Sable's higher-pitched call cut through the wind from the alley, and Molly's quick, urgent yelps joined in. The sound echoed off the rotting walls of the lumberyard, bouncing from every direction until it felt like the building itself was alive with growls and warning cries. Earl faltered, his eyes darting toward the basement door, as if the sound could come pouring through the walls at any second. That moment's hesitation was all the pack needed. A blur of fur and muscle came from behind him. Duke and Ranger 2. Slipping in through the rear service door Claire Mason had forced open moments earlier. Duke's jaws closed on Earl's gun arm, his weight driving the man sideways, while Ranger 2 lunged low, teeth locking onto the cuff of Earl's coat and yanking hard. The revolver clattered to the concrete and spun away. Max stayed planted in front of Ryan, blocking any chance Earl might reach him again. Upstairs, the crash of boots signaled the arrival of Sheriff Briggs and Claire, rifles raised. Briggs descended the stairs 2 at a time, his voice low but hard. "On the ground, Earl, now!" Pinned by 2 snarling dogs and staring down the barrel of Claire's weapon, Earl finally sagged, his shoulders collapsing inward. Briggs stepped forward, cuffed him without ceremony, and hauled him to his feet. "You're done," the sheriff said simply, before dragging him toward the stairs. Emily appeared at the basement doorway, cheeks red from the cold, her breath quick. She crossed the space in 3 strides and crouched beside Ryan. "You're all right now," she said, her voice gentler than he had ever heard it. While Claire escorted Briggs and Earl out, Emily glanced toward Max. He had gone still again, ears rotating toward something faint outside. Far away, beyond the lumberyard's main structure, a soft, metallic thump came over the radio slung at Emily's hip. It was the same battered handheld she had pulled from her father's workshop that morning, hastily rigged to a portable antenna. She pressed it to her ear and frowned. "That's not static." Briggs, already halfway up the stairs, paused. "What is it?" "Metal on wood, and—" She twisted the volume dial. "Listen." The faintest sound of shuffling feet came through, along with a muffled whimper. Emily's eyes widened. "That's a child!" Briggs didn't hesitate. "Where?" Emily closed her eyes, recalling the radio's earlier quirks. "West end of the lot. There's an old foreman's shack. It's falling apart, but it has a metal roof. That's what's causing the echo." Briggs handed Earl off to Claire and gestured for Emily to lead the way. Max moved with her without needing to be called, Molly trotting behind, tail high. The shack was barely standing, its planks warped and its windows long gone. Emily eased the door open to find a small shape curled up in the corner under a filthy blanket. A girl, no older than 9, with pale skin and tangled blonde hair. Her wide blue eyes stared at them for a moment before she shrank back, clutching the blanket tighter. "It's okay," Emily said softly, kneeling a few feet away. "We're here to take you home." The girl didn't move until Max stepped forward, lowering his head so the bright orange blindfold was level with her gaze. He sniffed once, then simply lay down in front of her, still and calm. The girl's eyes softened, her tiny hand creeping out to touch the fur on his neck. When Emily lifted her into her arms, the girl didn't resist. Briggs was already on the radio calling for a medic team. "Name?" he asked. "Chloe," the girl whispered. Emily carried her out into the snow, Max pacing at her side. Behind them, the wind caught the last echoes of the pack's earlier chorus, carrying it across Pine Hollow like a promise kept. The storm broke overnight, leaving Pine Hollow washed in a rare, crystalline sunlight. The sky was a clear, brittle blue, the kind that came only after the cold had wrung every drop of moisture from the air. Snow glittered across rooftops and sidewalks, crunching under the boots of townspeople gathering in the square outside the sheriff's office. Word of the rescue had spread faster than the weather could bury it. Shopkeepers closed early, children were bundled into colorful scarves and mittens, and even the reclusive old-timers from the northern ridge had come down to see it for themselves. At the center of the square, a low platform had been set up, draped with the faded green and gold banner of Pine Hollow. Ryan Cooper stood on that platform, his uniform crisp despite the sling holding his injured arm. His brown hair was neatly trimmed again, though the shadows under his eyes told of sleepless nights and cold basement hours that hadn't quite faded. There was something quieter about him now, gratitude mixed with the lingering weight of what could have been. Beside him was Sheriff Tom Briggs, the lines in his weathered face softer than usual, and Emily Carter, her hair loose for once, cheeks pink from the cold. Emily wore her father's old canvas shop coat over a navy sweater, and in her gloved hands she held a small wooden box. But the real center of attention was on the ground before the platform. Max sat tall, the bright orange blindfold snug over his eyes, his sable and black fur brushed clean, though a faint scar above his shoulder still showed from an old injury. Around him, the rest of the pack, Duke, Sable, Ranger 2, and Molly, formed a loose half-circle, their bodies relaxed but eyes always moving. Ryan stepped forward, his boots crunching on the packed snow. His voice carried easily across the square. 3 days ago, I was locked away in the dark with no way out. I had no reason to believe anyone could find me in time, but someone did, and that someone couldn't even see me. He looked down at Max, his expression softening. He didn't just come alone, he came with a family, a team, and they all risked everything to bring me home. He opened the wooden box Emily had been holding. Inside was a set of 5 leather collar tags, each engraved with the Pine Hollow K9 emblem and a single word, Sentinel. Ryan knelt, ignoring the ache in his arm, and fastened the first tag to Max's collar. The metal glinted in the winter light. "For you, Max," he said, his voice low enough that only those close could hear, "and for the family you lead." He moved down the line. Duke, who accepted the tag with a quiet huff. Sable, whose ears twitched at the touch. Ranger 2, who couldn't stop shifting with excitement. And Molly, who leaned in against his knee. When he stood again, the applause rolled over the square like a warm tide, mixing with the laughter of children leaning over the rope lines to get a closer look at the dogs. Briggs took the podium briefly. "These animals didn't just save a deputy," he said. "They brought back a child, reunited families, and reminded this town that we take care of our own, no matter how small, no matter how lost." His gaze found Emily. "And thanks to Emily Carter, we're going to keep doing that." Emily stepped forward, a little awkward under the attention. "My father taught me that radios aren't just for voices, they're for listening. Sometimes to the world, sometimes to what no one else hears. These dogs, they listen too. Better than we do." She took a breath. "From now on, Carter's Radio and Repair will also be a hub for search efforts, equipment, tracking, whatever it takes, and Max and his team will have a place here, always." The cheering rose again, but Max simply tilted his head as if weighing the sound. To him, applause was nothing. The warmth of the pack, the steady hand on his shoulder, these were the rewards that mattered. Later that afternoon, as the square emptied and the cold began to creep back in, Emily led the dogs home. Her shop smelled faintly of pine from the wreath she'd hung on the door, and the big cast-iron stove in the corner radiated welcome heat. She spread an old quilt in front of it, and one by one, the pack settled down, Duke near the door as usual, Sable curling into the deepest corner, Ranger 2 and Molly pressed together for warmth. Max lay in the center, his orange blindfold catching the glow from the fire, The wind outside rattled the eaves, and a stray draft lifted the edge of the blindfold just enough to make it flutter. Emily watched from her workbench, a small smile tugging at her lips. Even without sight, Max's head turned slightly toward the sound, ears forward, ready for whatever came next. It was a picture she knew she'd carry forever, a reminder that even in the absence of light, a steady heart and sure instincts could still lead the way home. Sometimes God does not send miracles wrapped in gold or with the sound of trumpets. Sometimes he sends them with 4 paws, a wagging tail, and a heart that will not give up, even when the world turns dark. Max could not see, but he could lead. He could not speak, but he could save. That is the mystery and the beauty of God's work. He uses the unlikely to do the impossible. In our own lives, we may walk through seasons where we cannot see the way forward. We may feel like we are stumbling in the dark. But remember this, even in those moments, God is guiding us, often through people, or even creatures we least expect. All he asks is that we trust, step forward in faith, and never stop listening for his voice. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below and tell us what part of Max's journey spoke to you the most. And if you believe that God still sends miracles into our world, type Amen in the comments. Subscribe to this channel for more true and inspiring stories of faith, courage, and second chances. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may his light guide you, even through the darkest nights.